Hello, and welcome to the Political Institutions and Political Economy PIPE Symposium on the political economy of empire. We're here at the Bedrosian Center at the Price School at the University of Southern California. I'm Jeff Jenkins, the director of the Bedrosian Center and the PIPE Collaborative. Empires, or political units made up of several territories and peoples, typically created by conquest and divided between a dominant center and subordinate peripheries, have existed across recorded time, both ancient and modern. The political economy of empire as a scholarly enterprise could take several forms, including studying the cost required to maintain and defend the empire, the profits generated by peripheries or colonies, the laws regulating trade within the empire and development within the colonies, and the conflicts within and across empires for current and future wealth. Scholars of comparative economic and political development have long studied empire and modern formal and quantitative tools in social science, along with a greater focus on and appreciation of the deep roots of history and their impact on contemporary political economic decision-making, have created new and exciting avenues for inquiry. The Political Economy of Empire Symposium brings together scholars doing some of the most cutting-edge research on topics like how the wealthy's tax evasion behavior is shaped by the level of rule of law and its consequences for physical capacity building, what role Christian missions played for European colonial empires, how regimes determine the allocation of their budgets given competing economic priorities, how does an empire fragment, how sustained rivalry between states is connected to exploitation elsewhere, and how and at what costs are formal property rights provided. We have 6 papers divided among 3 panels, along with 3 discussants, 1 per panel, prepared to offer comments. I've asked paper authors to shoot for 20 minutes maximum for their paper presentations. Discussions should try for about 10 minutes max per paper. That will leave some time at the end for back and forth and questions from the audience. If you have questions along the way, you should feel free to type them in the Q&A box or the chat box. I'll be monitoring those boxes as we go along. Finally, following the presentation of the 6 papers, the Political Economy of Empire Symposium will conclude with a keynote talk by Sean Gailmard of UC Berkeley on his forthcoming book, Agents of Empire, English Imperial Governance and the Strategic Foundations of American Institutions. And we're just about time, so why don't I turn it over to the first set of panelists. And the first paper is Seeds of Secession, the Political Economy of the Spanish Empire's Fragmentation by Fernando Arteaga of the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate being here with all the papers. That seems fascinating. What I will be talking today is research that I've been doing several years that I have been basically just not continuing it, but I think it's relevant, and the more I read about this topic, the more I continue to be interested in it, which is just talking about how does an empire fragment with the application of the Spanish Empire and trying to define what is different from the empires in the 18th century compared to the empires in the 19th century. And we will see that I think there are many, many differences. So the questions that I'm asking within this paper is just trying to understand the process that led to the empire fragmentation in the Spanish Americas. And I will follow more or less 2 literatures where I think I'll be complementing and I will be reinterpreting the general approach to how we now understand this. So the way in which I actually think I contribute to the literature is not by trying to give a novel, using a novel data set or using novel ideas. It's just trying to use what is available right now, but trying to approach it in a more political economy framework. And there are 2 strands of literature. The first one is how can we explain the Spanish Americans fragmentation is mostly through the idea that Napoleon invaded Spain in the 18th century, in the early 19th century, which led to a power vacuum that created the initial impetus towards independence in the different regions across Americas. And that is kind of a compelling reason in general, because of course that is the direct approach, the direct reason that led the many independentist leaders to want to secede. But once we create counterfactuals and once we actually think about different periods in which power vacuums existed in general, we can see that all these other power vacuum periods did not create the incentives towards secession. I think the most relevant one would be just comparing to the 18th century and to the War of the Spanish Succession, which was not similar, but it was a civil war between the Bourbon and Habsburgs to basically see who would actually become the next king of the next governors of the Spanish Empire. And yes, it created some conflicts, but it didn't lead towards independence. And I think that is one counterfactual that we need to be aware. So alone, the Napoleonic invasion is not enough to understand how the Spanish Empire is fragmented. The second one, literature, is more theoretical and more or less approaches a general overview about how empires are actually created, or how, not empires, but polities in general. And here we have the literature by Alessine and Sporlore and all those economists, political scientists, and even computer scientists that basically try to understand that there is an equilibrium size of the size of nations that we can understand through the idea that there are some benefits of being united, there are some fixed costs in providing public goods, and there are basically some costs in being united. If we think that there are differences among many peoples and they do not share the same values, there will be some actually problems there. What creates the equilibrium is that, well, there are some benefits that are to be achieved. The way in which the ancient empires solved this problem was mostly through decentralization. And there are a couple of models that try to explain this. But in the literature, we mostly associate with the Habsburg period, which is the idea that in general, the ancient empires did not provide any kind of public good. Basically, they just taxed to gain funds to wage war, and that was the only thing that they provided. So kind of a security against the poachment of other nations, but that was the only thing that they secured. So they did not provide public goods. So the way in which they actually had to preserve unity just was to giving a lot of autonomy to the regions. So what we see in general for most of the empires before the 18th century is that a lot of them actually created a lot of autonomy for the regions. Within the space of the English America, which must be more familiar, Edmund Burke kind of talk about this period, about the United States, about the salutary neglect. So it's the whole idea that what matters the most is that if we want to keep these regions that are overseas united in this one polity, well, they need to be very, very autonomous. My argument more or less follows the transition from this period of autonomous regions to an attempt towards centralization that was failed. So we look into the 18th century as a period of transition between the old world, the old empires, and the creation of what we consider nowadays kind of a nation state. The idea that we need to create a state that is centralized, that is kind of powerful to compete with other empires. And in order to do that, well, you need to modernize the way that you collect taxes, and you need to have a more direct control over how you rule the regions. And that was created by the events of the 18th century. So the way in which I explained here is quite easy. First, you have kind of the institution. So my argument is quite straightforward, quite simple. We have an institutional status quo, which I would call the empire of autonomous regions. They are united to the crown. The crown is kind of the arbitrage here, the one that provides the connection between the many regions and the many elites between regions. But besides that, there is not a lot of unity. There is not a common market at all. There are, of course, commodities that are being transported, but talking about markets in this period is kind of difficult. So, but the problem, of course, is that there are some events that occur in the 18th century that I think historically are known to be important in explaining several events. The most important one that I will put more attention is the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War basically meant that the English Empire became the most prominent one. The English basically succeeded mostly in North America, in South Asia, and basically the French, after the 7 Years' War, there was no French in North America and South Asia. So that created a huge shift in power that some explain the French Revolution out of the 7 Years' War, the beginning of the Prussian reign, empire, and so on. Within the Spanish Americas, it also created kind of the need towards reforms that will be needed in order to compete with the English. Because one of the things that happened that I will just explain in just a moment is that the English basically capture all the important trading pots that secure the way in which the empire traded. So that created incentives towards reforms that will centralize. that will actually centralize the government, but also will assure that the way in which the empire traded was more secure. I will explain in just a moment how this actually occurred. But through the end, the problem is that these were failed policy reforms. It just created incentives towards secession because it empowered some alternative elites, and it actually did not succeed in creating decentralization enough, which led to the wars of independence. So I will need to go a little bit fast, but I have within the paper, I have a political economy model in which I center about how rents accrue within the Spanish Empire. So the most common way to approach this problem is just to refer to the idea that there are income that is generated through mining. So it's commonly known that the most important export that the Spanish Empire generated is just silver. And this is basically through the mining. But the way in which the empire was ruled, not through the accruement of this income, but basically to the distribution of rents to the different elites. How these autonomous regions became tied to one polity is through the distribution of rents. And here is where basically we have kind of a monopolic and monopsonic approach towards how rents were distributed, to the idea that we have merchant guilds that control trade to the whole Spanish Empire. So we have three mostly. Well, we have three at the beginning: in Seville, Spain, in Mexico City, and in Lima. And through this, basically, all the goods that were traded within the Spanish America and to the rest of the world, to the Philippines, to Asia, and to Seville in Europe, were basically were accruing. These guys were accruing rents, and through that, basically, they also kind of provided control over their own regions. So what we have is in my models that I have three key actors: miners, merchants, and the crown kind of plays a kind of, as I just previously said, a middling role between trying to, of course, collect tax out of giving these privileges, but also through the idea that it provides kind of an arbitrage between the different actors involved in the trade. So I provide a model in my paper that tries to basically replicate the way in which this occurred. I will skip it for now just because for brevity, and I will just go to explain more or less how the trade occurred in the Habsburg period, more or less, and how the institutional status quo before, which we will say, the 7 Years' War or the Habsburg status quo. So it was a pretty medieval standard way of trading through trade fairs. So there were kind of these flotas that connected the Atlantic and the Americas. And these were pretty heavily guarded and centralized. These basically sailed every 2 years or more. And there were many that sailed from Seville to trading fairs in Panama and in Veracruz. And there they met their American counterparts and they negotiated. So this is quite medieval. It's just the way in which medieval ways of trading occurred. And this was stable while basically Spain more or less kind of controlled seas, or actually did not have any important circumstances that actually delayed the way in which trade occurred, or besides just natural events. Of course, when we think about pirates and the romanticism about pirates, that was relevant, but really pirates kind of poach around the cities that were in the Spanish Main, but they really, if you look into the statistics of how many pirates succeeded in actually capturing the flotas, there were not that many, because the flotas were heavily guarded. And so this was a successful way to distribute rents between the merchant elites, and the merchant elites then distributed the resources throughout their own regions. And so there was a basically very tight control. And this was a successful status quo until, I argue, until the 7 Years' War, by which basically this system collapsed because now the British kind of dominated the waves. So the exogenous shocks that I try to assess here is basically a picture of the capture of Havana by the British. So in the 7 Years' War, the British basically captured the two most important ports in the Atlantic and Pacific for the Spanish, which were Manila and Havana. They later exchanged for Florida. Florida used to be Spanish, then it was basically changed for a return of Havana and Manila to Spain, and Florida became kind of English. But this made the Spanish realize that they needed to reform quickly their empire. So the Bourbon reforms, of course, started in Spain very early on, but they started basically only becoming a thing within Americas after the 7 Years' War. And there were many other reforms that tried to actually do more basically because the status of competition between the empires in England, in Europe kind of increased even more. The French Revolution, of course, created even more problems for the Spaniards because now they didn't have the ally in France and now they have a competitor, and that created more problems. So the way in which, what were these Bourbon reforms? Quickly, they are understood as several different reforms that apply to different spaces within the Americas. Here I just kind of summarize one of those that I think are the most relevant. And I can categorize them between the idea of trying to build more state capacity, this idea of modernizing. But there's also an alternative reform that tries to liberalize trade, which is the one that I put the most importance, because as I previously stated, the problem with the status quo, previous status quo, is that the empire was centralized and trading fairs occurring in basically very few trading fairs in trading spots. But this system collapsed, so now you need another way to trade. So now you have to liberalize trade in order for trade to continue. Otherwise, you run the risk of the British kind of repeating the same thing that happened in the 7 Years' War, which is just basically collapsing the way in which trade occurs. So how can you actually reconcile the idea that at the same time that you want to centralize, you also actually liberalizing a lot of things? And alternatively, we have also some Bourbon reforms that we can consider even rentistic, which is the approval of many other merchant guilds to extract more resources from them, and even expropriations from resources. So of course, what you see also is that there's a difference in terms of when these different reforms were being applied. And I don't have time to explain a little bit, but my argument more or less states that in general, what we will see is that when the system collapses, first you have an attempt towards basically modernizing. And so you have some early reforms that are aimed towards that. But when the shocks kind of repeat through time, you have kind of a problem of dynamic consistency in the way in which the crown aims to reform itself. So now, instead of just wanting to sustain the empire in the long run towards kind of creating more incentives towards extracting resources in the long run, now you have more incentives towards just trying to expropriate and extract more resources in the short run, which basically is these later ones. You start seeing that many rentistic groups start appearing within the empire because they were given privileges by the crown in lieu of basically providing resources to the crown. And this was always in the context that Spain was involved in a lot of wars in the 19th century. So in my model, more or less, what I aim to explain is how there's a relationship between the collapse of the Spanish trading system and basically the creation of these many rentistic groups. So one of the results that I have in my model is that more or less I can explain the creation of these many groups. So we have more groups are being created here. This is just a simulation. Really, the index numbers do not tell anything. It's just kind of the pattern is what happens the most. We also see more or less an increase in the price. And this is something that I kind of back up with qualitative evidence, because the quantitative evidence is kind of sporadic, at least for most of these things. So I cannot account for wholesalers' profit. This is just something that I think we can see that in general, when I talk about wholesalers, this is basically the merchant guilds that are cooperating. When you see that there are profits are diminishing, and the amount of merchant guilds that are operating within the empire are increasing, so the competition increases, and we kind of see that this all leads towards a new status quo by which you have new empowered elites that are kind of discontent with the way in which the empire was ruled. The Napoleonic invasion kind of creates the incentives towards even more discontent, and that kind of creates the need for kind of fragmentation. When you look into the geography of independence in America, you will see that basically the places in which independence occurred were basically Venezuela, but today is Venezuela and Argentina. And these were kind of peripheral elites for most of the historical time of the Spanish Empire that were kind of empowered by the reforms, but they did not benefit. The elites there did not benefit from the previous arrangement, and they were not benefiting from the new one. So you have an incentive towards a seat. the ones that resisted the most independence were the ones located in Mexico City and Lima, because they were the elites that actually enjoyed privileges in the past and had enjoyed kind of a connection and had the most to lose. So those ones were basically the last to become independent. At the end, what I'm trying to say is that, and I think with this, my concluding comments would be, is that you have kind of a problem of dynamic inconsistency in the way in which basically the fiscal reforms were applied. You have a problem of trying to create a modernization of an empire that basically failed. So it's an example of failed state reforms. You have the idea that first you want to improve tax and state capacity, but then you just try to extract to survive. Then you have the idea that they have a misalignment in the incentives across these different actors. You empower some actors that were not allied with you, and that creates incentives towards secession. Now, if you want to actually compare this to what's happening in other places, so what was happening it's very similar to the process of independence in North America. So in the US, when we think about the Tea Party and so on, it's revolt against taxes and against basically different misalignment of incentives between the colonials there and those in Britain. So kind of and this is all was created also for the 7 Years' War. So what I'm trying to say is that there's not much difference. The difference lies in basically the previous status quo, of course. And when we think about comparison of why the Spanish Caribbean, for example, remained part of the Spanish Empire after all this happened, well, that's because there were local elites within the Spanish Caribbean, that because they were very small, they actually relied a lot on Spain, on Europe as a trading hub for basically the trading of their commodities. So they lacked the incentives towards secession as the other mainland regions in the Americas. And when you look into Brazil and Portugal, I think it's also relevant to notice that what happened there is that, yes, Napoleonic invasion created also the initial incentives, but they did not fragment into several countries, not because there were not incentives there. There were some attempts in the north of Brazil compared to the south of Brazil, but also because the trading routes were not collapsed, because Portugal, historically speaking, was an ally of England, and also because the Portuguese king actually moved to Brazil. That kind of assured that a more tight control, which did not happen in the Spanish Americas. And I had to rush a little bit here, but I think I was concise in explaining more or less what my hypothesis of why the Spanish Empire fragmented. And again, this is nothing really new in terms of the data set or of Naval. It's just kind of a reinterpretation in terms of providing a political economy framework that emphasizes the role of merchant elites in actually providing political control in their own regions. And thank you.
Thank you, Fernando, and exactly on time. Wonderful. Good start to this. So the second paper is Rivalry and Empire, How Competition Among European States Shaped Imperialism by Jan Vogler at the University of Konstanz.
All right. So first of all, let me thank Jeff and also Nicholas for organizing this colloquium. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm thrilled to get this opportunity to present this piece of research. And Jeff already read the title to you, so I won't do that again. But let me tell you what partially motivated this paper. What you see here is a map of the European empires and the different territories across the world that they ruled. And what we can very clearly see is that most of the world at one point or another in time was under the rule of European empires. And as countless studies in political science and economics have demonstrated, there are still legacy effects of these empires visible even in the present day. And so imperialism is of extraordinary political and economic relevance. And so it has been studied widely. What is at the core of my paper, or the puzzle that I'm looking at, is the two fundamentally different types of inter-polity relationships to the inside and to the outside of Europe. While relations among states to the inside of Europe were much more symmetric, to the outside of Europe, they were often hierarchical and exploitative. And it shows this depiction here of the Congress of Vienna to illustrate that, which is one of those episodes of European history when the states came together recognized each one another as equals and came to common solutions. And of course, often this included a lot of hostility between those states, but nevertheless, the states considered each other as functional equals. This was very different with respect to the rest of the world. And I chose this depiction of colonialism to illustrate that, as you know, world history also has centuries of European rule over large parts of the world, exploitation of peoples and territories in other world regions. And I'm trying to connect these two different types of inter-polity relationships. So the research question really at the heart of this paper is, why was there this difference? And is there a relationship among these different relations to the outside versus to the inside of Europe? And before I go into detail on what my argument is, let me just give you a broad overview, including the key takeaway of the study. The key takeaway and my primary argument is that it was the symmetric military and economic rivalries inside of Europe that actually were partly constitutive, were an enormously important factor in creating the asymmetric relationships that had the key features of subordination of other world regions and their exploitation with polities in those other world regions. And this is different from previous research because most previous research has looked at these different phenomena, but has not connected them in the way that I do. As I mentioned, there are tons of studies on imperialism and its effects all around the world, a very prominent literature in comparative political economy. There's also huge literature on intra-European rivalries. Most of you will be familiar with Tilly's work, for example, and that's not the only one. There's just a huge literature based on that. And then the final set of literature is the Marxist theory tradition that also looks at intra-European dynamics and tries to explain extra-European expansion and exploitation. But this one is really focused on the economic dimension, while my study covers the economic dimension too, but it is much more centered on the political ideas, on political goals, and also on military rivalries. So military and political aspects are somewhat underdeveloped in the Marxist theory tradition, while they are at the center of my work. My contribution, therefore, is that I connect to these multiple strands of the HPE literature, and I'm trying to develop a novel theory about how the one set of relationships on the European continent led to the other set of relationships to the outside of Europe. And the empirical test is two qualitative case studies of sustained and intense rivalries. Sustained and intense is really central to my theory here. One is England and France in the long 18th century, and the other one is Britain versus Germany in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So let me get into the details of my argument. And what I want to start with is because sustained interpolity and later mainly interstate rivalries in Europe are so central to what I'm arguing, I just want to briefly elaborate on why these rivalries were sustained in Europe. What were the origins of rivalry in Europe? And part of this is that both rulers and political elites, to those leaders of all polities in Europe, status concerns were highly relevant, and status was often associated with territorial gains. Who ruled over a larger territory with more population, more agricultural potential. People who ruled over those territories often gained status and prestige. And recent studies have shown that status and prestige concerns were a key driver of conflict in Europe. So this is one really a core aspect here. It is nevertheless important to ask, why did this not lead to a single empire unifying Europe? Why was competition sustained? And there are multiple reasons for this. I argue that it was a distinct combination of geography, climate, and politics that was found in Europe that sustained competition. And these multiple features of the European continent were highly beneficial to fragmentation. These are also political features, as I will show in a moment. But let me talk about first climate. Climate was highly diverse across Europe. And what this made difficult was for a single empire to create armed forces that would be able to operate under all climatic conditions without problems. So mobilizing in all different theaters of war with a single empire was very difficult, given that climate differed so much, and it often gave local defenders an advantage, an informational advantage, an experience advantage when it came to these different climate zones. Also, Europe has a very fragmented geography, and one of the crucial features here is that the Alps are at the geographic midpoint of Europe and make it difficult to have one single center ruling Europe from there, in part because the Alps divide the different regions of Europe. Of course, we also have different mountain ranges, such as the Carpathian Mountains on the flanks of Europe and the Ural Mountains. And all of this creates difficulties for the military progression of armed forces who are trying to occupy different regions. Often these difficult terrains give local defenders an advantage. In addition to that, you also have multiple peninsulas, such as the Iberian Peninsula and the British Isles, and only a combination of sea power and land power makes it possible to occupy them, unless you want to go through very narrow geographic corridors. And so all of this means that it is easier to sustain rivalry. So on the one hand, we have these geographic conditions that make it very difficult for a single military center to rule the continent, and that is part of the theory. But then there are also political conditions. And most importantly here, the role of the Catholic Church, which was highly interested in preventing a single secular ruler. All of this benefited to the emergence of the system of inter-polity relationships, where we had a highly fragmented system and not a unifying empire, including balancing behavior by states that contributed to preventing a hegemon. So we have sustained an intense military and economic rivalries and constant technological innovation, which is important because that will play a role in my next argument. So what were the consequences of this kind of competition? Now we get to the core of my theory. The core of my theory is connecting this competition to the desire for imperial expansion. And I suggest that the first mechanism, the first relevant mechanism, is that the struggle for prestige, which the European rulers experienced on the continent, that was part of that inter-polity competition, led to the incentive to gain territory overseas. Territorial gains were, of course, valuable and indicative of ruler status. And in the status competition among European rulers, they played an enormous role. But for that very reason, it was also very difficult to occupy territory in Europe because it was fiercely defended by those who were in its possession. And so the territorial gains in other world regions were often much easier in part because of this military superiority that the Europeans had as a result of decades and centuries of intra-European warfare. Often their military capacities were superior to those of peoples in other world regions. And in addition to that, occupying territory outside of Europe sometimes also meant gaining strategically important positions in those enduring rivalries among states. The second mechanism is one that focuses on the pressures on public budgets. And here it is important, of course, to recall that when we have sustained an intense military competition, that is often extremely costly. And part of the reason why it is so costly is that both sides can, of course, escalate their expenditures in an attempt to gain relative superiority and this decisive power disparity. And so there's almost no end to that escalation, and that can lead to very steep increases in military expenditures. This put enormous pressures on public budgets, and so rulers had very, very strong incentives to find new sources of tax revenue. And there was a widely held belief, and not necessarily always a valid one. Some colonies also were not that economically valuable, but there was a widely held belief that through the extraction of raw materials, through taxing new populations, and also through gaining export markets, that empires were beneficial in an economic sense and could help to fill those budget deficits. The third mechanism is one that focuses on interest groups. And of course, this also connects to the political economy literature on interest groups. What the state did, and even states who were not engaged in military conflict, often had to create armed forces just to create a credible threat of retaliation. And so they needed to build large armies. And of course, initially, these armies were tools in the hands of rulers. But also we know from the historical political economy literature and from the general political economy literature that once a state equips a group with coercive or economic means, it is likely that this group will gain its own interests and also act in with respect to these interests. And so these forces, my argument is, can turn into very powerful interest groups. And for armies and navies, once military conflict is over, they need to have a new purpose that legitimizes their status in society, their access to public resources. And so I suggest that imperialism was a natural next purpose for these groups, and that they were interested in engaging in imperial expansion because it legitimized their access to resources and their status in society. This might also explain the difference between land and sea empires, because of course land empires had very powerful armed forces, militaries on the ground. Sea empires had very powerful navies, and those navies had an interest in overseas imperialism, while the land forces had an interest in occupying territory adjacent to them in Europe. So let me summarize that. My theory is that if you have sustained and intense military and economic competition among polities, initially a set of polities, but later mostly states, then you have three different mechanisms. One is the desire to acquire more territory for prestige gain. The second one is opportunities to address budget pressures. And the last one is the creation of these powerful interest groups. All of these predict that we will observe imperial expansion. There's an auxiliary aspect of my theory, which is that there could also be feedback effects to inter-polity competition in Europe if there's escalation of colonial conflicts. But I want to stick to the main core mechanisms here in this presentation. I have a little bit more on that in the paper. I conduct two case studies. The first one focuses on France and England in the long 18th century. And here I look at the different mechanisms. And let me start with the first mechanism, where I also go back a little bit more in time. And here already English monarch James I was personally involved in his country's colonial enterprise in the form of the Virginia Company, very important historical development. And also the rivalry with other powers, according to the judgment of historians, was essential here to the first phases of colonialism. Here, for example, Andrews states that competition with entrenched interests and against the fierce hostility of the Iberian powers in their spheres of interest took place. And initially, it is true, though, that the English monarchs remained focused on Europe. That is important to acknowledge. So the rivalry in Europe was their key concern, but imperialism also derived from it in part. And after 1689, this changed to some extent in the sense that they became more focused on also overseas imperialism. And one of my arguments is that it was in part because of the rivalry with France. Let's look at France. So colonialism was thought to bring glory to its rulers, and it was in particular Sun King Louis XIV who was driven by a very strong desire for prestige gains, among others through colonial conquest. And the French activity in North America was also in part due to the rivalry with England. I have another quote here from a historian who refers to the strenuous Anglo-French competition for political leadership in Europe and for supremacy in world markets. And Miquelon also states that this depended to a large extent upon the successful exploitation of colonies. Let me briefly talk about the second mechanism, and I want to just use this graphic here that shows military spending by Britain in the long 18th century. And what you can see here are certain spikes in expenditures. All of those are related to wars. And you can see that wars dramatically increased the spending by the British. And this was part of the reason why they then faced very huge debt, budget deficits, and they had to somehow refinance those budget deficits. They had to compensate for them. And so they engaged in heavy exploitation of colonial trade of their colonies, and the British state gained a lot of tax revenue through that. I will also say that, of course, this led to them trying to tax the American colonies more, which then triggered the American Revolution. So that's another story, but an interesting consequence, indirect consequence of that. Let me talk about the third mechanism, the creation of powerful interest groups. And here it is in particular the Royal Navy that became a very powerful institution, one of the most powerful institutions in early modern Europe. And a natural source of legitimacy for that institution was the acquisition and defense of colonies. And there are a couple of different historical episodes that I also referred to in the paper that show that the Royal Navy was not just merely a tool in the hands of the British rulers, but became a powerful interest group in itself. And this might also be an important difference to France, which was generally less successful at acquiring overseas colonies. It did have some, but it was less successful than the British. And here we see that the French Navy is actually much less powerful. It experienced declining funding and a decreasing size. And this might be related to France's geopolitical position and also the strength of its army. France was, of course, a major land and sea power at the same time. And so France in general had a less powerful navy and also less successful overseas colonialism. The second case study is Germany and Britain here in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And let me just start with this quote, which I really like. This is Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli on unification of Germany. He says this war represents the German Revolution. And he also states the balance of power has been entirely destroyed, and the country which suffers the most is England. And so you can see that German unification created an extremely powerful state at the center of Europe, and by doing that also destroyed the balance of power that had been highly beneficial to the leading world power of the time, Britain. So how did the different mechanisms play out in this rivalry? So there's a lot of evidence that the political elites in both of these countries believed that they were in a persistent struggle for status and prestige. And it was in particular German Emperor Wilhelm II who had this very strong desire for colonies. And I'm using the German term here, Weltmacht, world power status. He was really strongly interested in gaining colonies, and it was a lot about prestige. Prestige was a key mechanism here. Of course, territorial expansion in Europe was no longer possible without massive risks, without risking a great power war. And so all of this resulted in a scramble for Africa. Importantly, even though Britain actually already had a lot of territories around the world, Britain also acquired new territories and intensified its colonial rule at the time in different territories. And here are a couple of quotes. So this is again from Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. And here he clearly says that you can decide whether you want to be a comfortable England or whether you want to be a great country. And he equates that with being an imperial country. Another famous quote is by German Foreign Secretary von Bülow, who later became Chancellor, who says, "We do not want to put anyone in our shadow, but we also demand our place in the sun." And you can really see that there is a key status motive here in these quotes that is in accordance with the judgment of historians who think that the elites of these countries in general were strongly interested in international status. Let me talk about the second mechanism. Actually, in this case study, it's a little bit weaker, in part because Germany is an economic powerhouse at the time. England is on a little bit on relative decline, but is also the leading economic power in the world until the early 20th century. And so the second mechanism here doesn't apply to the same extent, in part because of the relative absence of direct hostilities among the great powers. But there's an indirect way in which it applies, and that is that Germany created this massive and expensive naval armament program as of 1898. And we can see this as basically creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the German state then experienced budget pressures and it had created the tools to acquire colonies. And so that became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And maybe in part for that reason, a key goal of establishing German colonies was their economic exploitation. Now, the third mechanism, I think, is especially visible in the German case. And here it was Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz who pushed for significant naval armament, in part to challenge the leading sea power England. But part of that challenge was also the hope to gain colonies through that. And German naval officers, in particular, as a whole, embraced an ideology of navalism, which suggested that Germany needed a powerful navy and also a lot of colonies to establish and maintain its great power status. And so all of these mechanisms apply here as well. And I have a little map here of the German colonies in Africa, where Germany had the largest territorial gains during that period. So let me wrap this up. In conclusion, two phenomena characterize the European state system for centuries historically. The first one is the relatively symmetric internal relationships, which manifest themselves in lasting military and economic rivalry. And the second one is the extremely hierarchical and exploitative external relationships in the form of imperialism. And what I was trying to suggest here in this paper, what I was trying to argue, is that there's a very clear relationship between the two, in the sense that the first set of relationships, the symmetric ones, incentivize imperial expansion to the rest of the world. And the reason for this were these three different mechanisms: prestige from colonial gains, the ease of territorial conquest outside of Europe, budget pressures, and then finally creation of powerful interest groups in the form of standing armies and navies that initially were tools, but later became powerful actors in their own right. And with that, I would like to thank you. And if you have any further comments in the future, if you come across any literature that might be helpful for this paper or is related to it, feel free to contact me after this. And also thanks in advance to Ali Cerrone for reading the paper and commenting on it.
All right. Thank you, Jen. So both people were right at 20 minutes. Excellent. Great start. So over to Professor Ali Cerrone, Cornell University, who will be discussing both papers.
Well, first of all, thanks to Jeff and the organizers. Unfortunately, understanding the motivations behind empire is sadly relevant, but this is a great set of papers and a great conference. And it was a pleasure to discuss both of these papers. And they share some common kind of similarities. Both are salient work on important topics with imperial ambitions. The pun is intended because both of you tried to write books in each of these individual articles. So much of my commentary is going to be encouraging you to work within the article format. But both incorporate broad reading of the historical record, which is very tough to do. They deserve a lot of credit for. I found the historical narratives compelling, so no low-hanging fruit in terms of being incorrect about history or kind of what you're using. And I also found it refreshing that you look at causal processes outside of kind of the standard colonial outcomes. So these are kind of both fresh new papers. Both of you had similar weaknesses in your research design. And so my goal today is to help suggest ways forward to improve both papers. Okay, so first to start with Fernando's paper. I actually think from a macro perspective, the paper might benefit from a restructure because the story is a bit hard to follow, I think, because you're tackling a lot of different things. And the current framing of the paper is some case detail about Spain and the colonies in New Spain, and then the agent-based model, and then more case detail and the historical narrative. So I kind of found it hard to find all of the pieces I needed to evaluate the argument and kind of your empirical work. So my suggestion would be to do, an introduction that lays out everything, then the model, but in a very abstract way. So abstract players, generalized case, crown, merchant guilds, and then the historical application where you're tying the model to the case. And I'll give you an example of a paper that does this well later that you can learn from. Also note that I think the framing is very, very broad, okay? So explaining empire fragmentation is a large goal, and actually I think a bit outside the scope of this paper. So I'd like you to think about this and about what your contribution is. Because you don't have any direct evidence for the collapse or some of the elite outcomes during this kind of state of turmoil, right? As a function of the Bourbon reforms. But your comparative advantage here is providing new evidence on an economic mechanism. And it's an interesting one, right? How do markets respond? The proliferation of these licenses, there's kind of endogenous strategic choice by elites here, but there are also forces that are kind of outside of the player's control, right? So really, I'd like you to double down on that unique contribution, because then you can fit that into all of the other work that tries to, explain the many reasons for the collapse of empire, right? And in particular, you need to, I think, make more clear, your testable hypotheses and contribution as relating to these market forces. Now, another thing that might help you do this, actually, help you pull out your own contribution more clearly from the text is to engage with the existing literature on Spanish colonies and Mexico. And some of this is, again, with the structure. So the first part of the paper is a bit undercited, or you rely heavily on two articles, which are relevant, but the restructure might help you this. But given your research design, I'd like to see more on kind of the shocks and competition within these restricted markets, in particular about the guilds, about how this type of economic activity works, because again, I think that that's your unique contribution. And then, given your framing, there's many alternative explanations for the collapse of empire. And there's some low-hanging key citations missing, which you need to add, namely Emily Seller's paper and Francisco Garfia's. So they have an AJPS that studies the role of centralizing reforms and disrupting the elite power relationships in colonial Mexico. This paper shares with yours the idea that building state capacity and taxes under Bourbon rule backfired. They had a system, it was collusion with the elites, the system was working, and then it all fell apart. But they also look at the role of exogenous shocks on elites and what's happened. And so it's not the shocks you're looking at, they look at drought and the subsequent economic consequences of this drought. But this is a paper that's very, very close to yours. And it's a complement, I think. So they are not, you guys are both kind of looking at different things. But this is also a very good example of a generalized model, then a historical case. And so no matter what, you really need to engage with this paper given its similarities. But then there are others. Also, sorry. So connectedpapers.com is your friend, especially for the colonial Spain papers. If you stick some of these papers in, connectedpapers.com is a website that will network citations. So for those in the room, including my mom, hi mom, who don't realize that Connected Papers is a resource, I would suggest that you look at it. because look at this. So this links to all of the papers that have political economy approaches to Spanish colonialism. So I encourage you to look at it. There's a whole bunch of things that I think would be useful for you. And then the other papers, which I really think you should address, the effective mining you do cite, but again, I think one of the contributions is how does your paper speak to these papers that are very close? Again, the massive demographic collapse in Mexico, trading in colonial Mexico, and then on the guilds, I really thought that I could use more information on guilds. I was kind of looking that up as I was going along just to make sure I was understanding the strategy here. And there's some other kind of interesting work on the guilds. So again, I think that this could make your paper richer. And if you cite these folks, you can spend more time on the economic side and not trying to, address all of the competing explanations for empire. Okay, quickly on your theory. So your theory is a lot. There's a lot going on. The causal story is a lot going on. But again, I think you have a clear theory about the economic shocks and how it affected the supply of guilds. And the causal chain about the guild stability of empire and the Bourbon reforms is not clear. So, you presented it in a bit more clear way during the presentation, but this is something that, you either really need to double down on the paper to make it very clear what happened, or again, I would pull a lot of this stuff out because I don't think it's relevant to your story. And the biggest weakness of the paper, I think, is that you tell a rich story, but then you present a historical narrative that's consistent with your story. So once we get past the agent-based modeling, I'm not sure to what extent the qualitative part is a test, right? And so I'd rather see, especially given the historical narrative is a substantial part of the paper. So half of the paper, while the agent-based model is actually very short, I would like you to see this part adjusted. And I'll give you an example of kind of how, right? I would like you to convince me that we need agent-based modeling, right? Because there seems to be a disconnect between the model and the historical evidence, because the historical evidence, you're talking about a lot of things that are not modeled directly or are a maybe cause of the turmoil that the markets happen, right? So first of all, convince me we need agent-based modeling. Or for the second half of the paper, I'd either like you to adopt a research design that could be empirical regression-based with kind of covariate adjustment. Also note, everyone, my slides are detailed. I won't say everything that's on the slides, but these are for the authors later. So either adopt an empirical approach or do a qualitative research design where you can more systematically use the historical evidence. Because my impression from reading the paper was that, not that your story is not correct, but, you're kind of finding evidence for the story as you go. And given the substantial historical narrative, it needs to have more research design there. And then when testing the agent-based model, there seems to be data constraints. So I got really interested in here, but you said there was some missing data in terms of some of the economic variables you'd like. But I would be careful because you mentioned that the tax revenue doesn't really match the predictions of your agent-based model, but the tax data is wrong. So maybe that's not an issue. If the tax data is wrong, can we trust the other data? So, work on this part of the paper because a reviewer would see that and go for blood. On the agent-based model, I'd like to see a discussion, a dedicated section to why this is a useful way to approach kind of some of your research questions. And in particular, why a simulation, right? So there are trade-offs. You can simulate some things while you can collect empirical data on other things. And why should we use kind of agent-based model? And again, the agent-based model is only really identifying a very small piece in your overall story. And I think that if you think that piece is, which I think you do, useful, you need to double down and discuss this in more detail. And this also means justifying some of the assumptions, because obviously simulations are a function of the parameters we put in. But some of the historical assumptions, especially about consumers in America, I thought could use more detail. Also, last kind of minor point, watch the wording, be careful of the use of equilibria here, because you're not really showing your equilibrium solutions in agent-based model if there are some. And your historical case actually involves actors kind of changing rules and taking actions in response to changing circumstances. So these could be suboptimal, but these actually might be equilibrium. Just because the status quo changed doesn't necessarily mean it's the steady state has fallen apart. And so if you have the solutions for the agent-based model, I'd like to see them. But anyway, really lots of good stuff in the paper. So my final advice would be pull out all of the Asian-based modeling, economic focus, and really build the paper around there, because that's, that's instantly citable. That would be an immediate contribution to the literature, opposed to focusing on kind of prior explanations of empire. Okay, moving on, Jan's paper. So this is another really ambitious project. It almost reads like a book. And so given that this is for an article, my kind of macro comment would be to kind of better articulate the research goal, because I thought that the paper was fighting itself a bit. So, is this kind of conceptual discussion and theory building? This is, typographies, outlining cases, and in particular, teasing out mechanisms that have been overlooked by the literature, right? Such as the endogenous creation of interest groups, such as this normative sense of prestige that rulers might have, which is, an additional parameter to utility function beyond economic concerns, right? So much of the paper does that, but then you kind of shift to a qualitative research design. But that, if you are actually trying to test this grand theory in the same paper, then, you need a stronger qualitative research design. And honestly, I think you could go either way. I think you could narrow the theory and do qualitative tests, or this could just be a theory building paper. So the choice is up to you, but I'm going to give you comments to kind of help you to do either of these things. Now, the impression when I'm reading the theory, which is a substantial part of the paper, is that it's very, very abstract. It was actually hard for me to figure out what century we were talking about, what countries were involved. And so I think you need to discuss the scope conditions more clearly in the theory and upfront, right? So this is both, does this grand theory change over centuries, right? Because we know that some of the concepts in your theory did change. What was empire, what was colonial, what were polities, right? So here we see the evolution of polities into nation states, right? So if a territory is not clearly defined, how does that affect both their territorial regional concerns and their ability to project, right? And would other rulers kind of take advantage of this? Similarly, kind of imperialism, right? What did this mean in 1600? What does this mean in later centuries, right? And again, this theory is really trying to be very cross-national. So on the one hand, it's not bad that it's abstract, but it's so abstract, it's hard to engage with fully in the first part of the paper. And also, I think you spend a lot of time on things we already know or not essential, right? So rulers care about territory. I don't think you need to prove, right? There are economic benefits to imperialism, or that Europe couldn't be a single country because there were various geographic constraints. This is not necessarily new, and I think it maybe takes up a lot of space that could be used to better discuss some of your mechanisms that are more interesting, I think more novel, right? And, I'd like you to narrow the focus on your ultimate kind of causal question of interest, and that includes working on figure 1 and figure 2, which I'm going to discuss in more detail now. So this is very pretty. I like the flow chart. It's very well done. But I'd like to push you on a couple things here, which is, I think I buy this story. I think that all of these mechanisms are at play. I think that this is probably true, right? But there are a few issues here. One is how cyclic this is, right? In sustained military competition, desire to acquire more territory, imperial expansion. I could flip these arrows, present this this theory chart that imperial expansion, right, leads to more territory, which then caused competition among polities, right? Similarly, this feedback mechanism, when you study complex problems, endogeneity is always an issue, but it also makes it cyclic, right? And so because of this, it's actually a little bit difficult to figure out how would you apply this? How would you test it? What is the proper research design because of all of these things? And this is where the scope conditions really matter. You kind of have to take a piece of this, say, we are already in this state in this year, moving forward, how did this work, right? And similarly, it's hard to operationalize, right? So, what is imperial expansion? How would we define intense military competition among polities? Because some of these European countries were fighting for hundreds of years, right? Now, you might be able to get metrics on intense, but, low-level squabbles that basically, define polities or border skirmishes, the difficulty in operationalizing some of this, I think also, bleeds into the test. And so the biggest aspect of this I would like you to work on is, because it's unclear how to operationalize the theory because it's so grand, you could find almost any evidence to support this, right? So you say rulers care about prestige. I think that's true, but you could find a quotation that rulers care about prestige. But, I don't know what this means, right? Is this the causal factor? Is this dictating all the behavior? Is the fact that a ruler says they care about prestige changing whether they ally with some countries or not? And so, as long as the theory is hard to operationalize, the choice of historical evidence, you could basically find anything, right? And so I really urge you to be more specific with this theory, even though you're trying to cover a lot of things, right? And that brings me to research design. So here, given the structure, you need a fully fledged qualitative research design, right? And so anything from Gehring will do. And in particular, whether you're going qual descriptive or qualitative causal, I think will matter, right? Because if you're qualitative descriptive, trying to tease out these mechanisms that no one's kind of shown before, then you want a set of modal cases, right? And some of the cases you've already chosen, which are canonical key players in military history over long periods of time, that could fit well with the qualitative descriptive, right? But if you're going qualitative causal, then case selection is everything, right? So you need a different case selection. Could be, the first instance of imperialism. It could be variation in the outcomes, who is successful or not, most similar, most different. Either way, you need to really, have a research design section, motivate your case selection. Because right now, so you're choosing sustained and intense cases, right? Which don't, I'm not sure how that maps. You might have had most similar systems design in mind, but it's not clear from, as this in the first draft, which is fine. And I'm wary about the comparison of having one of your cases be pre-industrial and the other case being post-industrial if you are going with qualitative causal. Time here is a confounder, an incredibly powerful confounder, both in your operationalization of your variables and just general kind of the cultural norms around imperial. So, again, I would be wary about the time, although it depends on the choices that you make and defend here. And also note, you were talking about outcomes in your case selection. This might have just been noting this for readers, but again, if the outcomes, both the independent variables and the outcomes are choosing your case selection, be careful, right? Because then this is something to be aware of when you're doing kind of qualitative research. And then finally, a few miscellaneous notes on the cases. I think the ratio of theory to case studies should shift. Again, I think there's a lot that you talk about in the theory that you don't need to. I would rather see more discussion of the evidence and the qualitative tests of the case because, it's about 5 pages for each case compared to 20 pages of theory. And so if this is going to be primarily a qualitative paper that tests stuff opposed to theory development, you need to shift the ratio to give more room and space to the qualitative test. I do think the historical experience with empire matters that wasn't really discussed. Both Britain as a sea power, but also the Prussian Empire. So what happens when you come? How do your conceptions of being colonial power come from being colonized yourself? The case studies also cover decades. I think that this is a trade-off that I'm not sure helps you. Also, cultural or ethnic reasons for conflict. So we talk about prestige, we talk about military, but here there might be reasons why you may or may not invade other people that have to do with cultural aspects at home. So this would be something, this is something that maybe folks who study this would question. I also think the interest group story is maybe the most interesting, but the least developed. So, the need for military expansion creates actors with vested interest in military capabilities. But this is kind of endogenous, and then they want to continue to pursue military expansion. What does this mean as an interest group? Is this separate from the ruler? Is this a function of success, either in their origins or what they do? So that's very, very interesting. It's not quite an interest group, right? And so I would like to see more about that. I think you could go into really neat directions. Also, finally, dogs that don't bark. So, colonialism, imperialism doesn't always succeed, right? So does this affect your theory? Does this affect your cases? That's kind of in the background. But anyway, really ambitious paper, lots of neat stuff going on. I will send my slides to both the discussants, but again, happy to follow up and continue the conversation. And it was a pleasure to read these papers.
Thank you, Ali. Excellent. Excellent job. The two sets of authors. Any responses to Ali?
Yeah, thank you very much for the comments. I really appreciate it. Yes, I am currently reworking, trying to provide more counterfactuals, kind of create a larger narrative that's based upon my history, my story, rather than just basically taking. I mean, this is a project that has been in the works for a long time. That's why it's kind of messy, honestly. But I'm trying to push it finally, now that I'm kind of in a stable position nowadays. I'm trying to publish it. So I'm currently reworking. So very much. Thank you very much for the comments. It is really helpful.
Jan?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Ali, for reading the paper and providing these detailed comments. Some I have to think a little bit more about before I can give a good reply, but I will try to address as many of them as I can in the final version of the paper. And let me just say, I think I agree with you that there is a cyclical element to the theory. I do think that one direction of the theory is a much more powerful direction than the other one. And that is because the intensity of warfare in Europe really put enormous pressures also in terms of survival on the rulers on the European continent. And so that was a different level of intensity that they experienced, and therefore I believe that that outward mechanism is the more powerful one. But I didn't want to, when you deal with historians, they will always come up with a few cases where, it's the other way around. And what I didn't want to do is to write a paper where people can say, well, you overlooked that really important possibility that it could also be the other way around. So while my theory and my analysis is really focused on the first direction of from interstate warfare in Europe to imperialism, I have to kind of acknowledge this other direction. And there are a couple of episodes in history, like the 7 Years' War, where we see a little bit more of the other direction. But also recently, historians have suggested that World War I was really not caused in any way. This for a long time, people held this belief that to some extent or to a large extent, World War I was caused by imperialism. And now I think the stronger consensus within history is that it was caused by intra-European affairs. I do agree on a lot of points that you made when it comes to being more specific about concepts, about definitions. And I do think I have to work on that. Also with respect to the case studies, I think that's a really good suggestion to be clearer about case selection and also connected to the qualitative methods literature. So I'll definitely do that. And also the scope conditions that you mentioned are really important. I have a little bit of that in the appendix. Probably it's hidden too much. And I think you're right. It needs to be much more upfront. So these are the comments that I can respond to directly. Also, just very quickly, someone said in the chat, is rivalry necessary for the argument? Is competition sufficient? So in general, to me, these terms are very, very similar. Of course, one of the arguments I also make in the paper is that there is a continuum. It is not like a dichotomous differentiation between, let's say more peaceful competition and then more military rivalry. One can move into the other, and it's a little bit more continuous. One argument I make in the paper, and this is an important one, is that it is an alternation between episodes of extreme hostility and direct conflict and then episodes of more muted competition that is actually most beneficial to imperialism. And the reasons are the budget pressures mechanism. You accumulate huge sums of debt that you then have to somehow work on. And the other one is you create these powerful interest groups that the dimension that Ali also highlighted in her comments. And once the war is over, once we go to a less intense form of competition, these two mechanisms will apply in an even stronger sense. So it's the alternation between more peaceful forms of competition and more hostile, more extreme, more intense forms of military rivalry that will lead to imperialism.
Excellent. Ali, any responses at all to anybody before we open it up?
We can open it.
Okay. So one question I have is, are these two books? Ali kind of suggested maybe there are books lurking behind these two papers. I assume they're larger projects, but are you imagining books behind these two?
Not really. That's very. I don't know. I mean, I think maybe in the long run, I will try to write something
Okay.
about the Spanish Empire because it's my whole project. I mean, all my research is about Latin America, colonial Latin America.
Okay. Of course, as we know, in the long run, we're all dead, but that's okay, right? So, Jan, is there a book here?
I would like to turn it into one. I mean, it was inspired. I do have a book manuscript that doesn't overlap with this to 100%, but the book manuscript definitely inspired the idea for this paper. And now I feel the paper actually is the more interesting project, and maybe the paper should take over the book in that sense. So I do think there's real potential here to develop this into something bigger. And also connecting again to Ali's comments, I do think that the current version of the case studies is a little bit more in what she labeled as qualitative descriptive. And I think there's a huge opportunity, if this is turned into a book project, to include case studies that are a little bit more varied and have different approaches, such as a most similar, most different research design. And Ali also mentioned at the end of her comments that it would also be nice to see, I guess, to see some states who failed, right, that failed. And I think that a book manuscript would also give the opportunity to look at cases where, imperialism maybe was not the outcome. And it would be interesting to ask why that was the case. So, I mean, there's a lot to do here, and there's a lot that can still be done. I think the paper is a core of a book, but a lot needs to be done to justify a full book manuscript.
Okay. So a couple questions popped in as you were talking. So Jenny Guardado is out there, and she's asking, how important is symmetric power? This is to Jan. If anything, European rivalry has been often among coalitions and balancing power because no single country could overtake others.
Yeah, that is absolutely right. But what we also have to remember is that these alliances were often very flexible. So one country could fight on one side of the alliance in one war and then could fight on another side in the next war. One of the reasons why I picked, for example, France and England is that in most wars throughout the 18th century, these two countries were actually on opposing sides. So it is true that there were other countries gathering around them and forming that coalition, but these two were the main rivals in the European state system. And in almost every war, they were opponents with one another. So a lot centered around them and the attempts of states to balance against what might be the biggest threat. So I do agree. It might also, just go beyond the ability that I have here in the paper to look at entire alliances, right? I mean, it's a big picture paper. It already deals with a lot. I think that might be something that could also be done in a book that comes out of this paper, right? Looking at how coalitions play a role here. I think it's an interesting question, an important one, maybe outside of what I can do in the paper.
Otto Kienitz asks, or he has a comment and a question. I would push Jan to engage with the work of German historian Isabel Hall, who explores how the practices of the German army as an interest group, scare quotes, pushed Germany into Southwest Africa, but she also makes the claim that the experiences of military colonial occupation were adopted in inter-European conflicts such as World War I. In general, both papers could do well with engaging more deeply with historians and not just the historical quote unquote literature, because as Ellie said, some of the mechanisms identified are well identified by historians. Any thoughts here from the two paper givers? Sometimes it really comes down to, you're writing a paper and you're imagining who your readers are, right? And if the readers aren't historians, you oftentimes have to talk a little bit more about some of the things that you think are necessary for the readers to kind of follow. And if you believe that historians are your readers, then you could skip ahead, right? Fast forward.
So I didn't know Isabel Hall's work, and I will have a look at that. It seems to be directly relevant to what I do. So thank you, Otto, for pointing this out. But what I would say is where I don't fully agree with Otto is that I'm not engaging with the historical literature, because I read a ton of history books. And in addition to that, I actually consulted with some of the leading historians of the subject. So for example, I think I had a 1 hour long phone conversation with Dale Miquelon, who's this historian who looked at colonial expansion in French Canada, who's an expert on the early modern period. I also contacted James Collins, also a historian. I engaged with multiple historians. So I don't engage with Isabel Hall yet, and I will certainly make sure to check out her work. But one thing I always do is when I work on a historical project is I always try to get the advice and the feedback of historians, because it's so important to me to present something that is historically accurate and also makes use of the knowledge that historians have gathered over decades. And I hope I do it here. Maybe I missed someone who is important, so sorry about that. But I don't think that I completely ignore that literature.
Any other questions? Any other thoughts from anyone?
This is just kind of to both of the authors. So I think, given the states that you're at, I think like Fernando, you could definitely write an article. I think it's really easy to pull out what you've done, put it in the context of the other work, right, on New Spain, and come up with a little piece. Now, this could be a larger part. I mean, you could pull out an article that would be a chapter in a book on this topic, right? Like, let's look at market forces, or let's look at the guilds and focus on that, that could be a chapter. So you have an easier time. Jan, I think you have to figure out, given the work you've already engaged with, given that historians in particular are, very mechanism driven and testing this type of thing, what would be the political science contribution here, right? So it's either going to be a more rigorous conceptualization of the variables and hypothesis testing, right? Which you could pull out a piece of this and do that for any one of your mechanisms, it's up to you. Or it's going to be a longer theory, which I think will be a book. So I think your path forward for an article is going to be much more narrow in scope. You can maybe work out some of the kinks, do an actual research design that historians would never do, or have a book. But I think for both of you, it's worth thinking of what the comparative advantages of are the tools that we use as political economists, right? And what can we say that historians have not said? If either of you could figure out the best part of the papers that you like, and in the Venn diagram between what you like and what you can contribute, then boom, that's publication gold, right? And that might help you dictate papers.
Letitia Abad has raised her hand and has stood up.
Yes. So this is a comment for Fernando. So some questions, because colonial Latin America is my jam. So there are a couple of things. One is like, I'm nitpicking about this. So when you look at trade routes, there's no trade route when you look at from Acapulco to Manila, which was super important, silver and all that thing. And then there's also just, going to Lima, right? So those are trade routes that are not on your map. And a historian is going to say like, hello, those are trade routes. So that's one. The other one, and I have not read the paper, so I have no idea. And I know that modeling is really hard. So there's one set of actors that are incredibly important, that are indigenous people. They're not there. And they just, participated in all sorts of things in terms of enabling this fragmentation. And I don't know how you incorporate it, but that is an actor. Those actors actually matter a lot in terms of how Latin America was ruled, how the fragmentation happened, where the concentrators of economic activity were. So I'm not really sure how you can do that. The other thing is and this is, historians have been really, the third comment I have is that historians have identified that markets in Latin America, colonial Latin America, did exist. And there was this colonial circuit that was very well developed. So I don't know if I misheard you when you said that the market integration and one of the assumptions that were not very well developed or something like that. A historian is going to take, is going to say like, no, you're not right. Especially during, as you go this 17th and 18th century, where you have, great, urbanization goes up to 11% in Peru and Bolivia. So those are assumptions that I'm not really comfortable with, but I may have misheard you about the market integration stuff about Latin America. Thank you.
Any response there, Fernando?
No, thank you very much for your comments. I did say that, but it was basically an oversimplification. So I apologize for that, because I know that markets did exist. So I just wanted to put like there were not markets like today. Just wanted kind of to say that. I do not consider indigenous within this model. I actually work with indigenous groups in other paper that is different. So yeah, that is a big group that I'm missing. But I mean, I think within the scope of the size of the interest groups and how they recreate and the importance of autonomous regions, I think it kind of they can be easily put into the same framework. I mean, we can argue about the usefulness of the framework in explaining how the indigenous actors interact. But if we look, for example, at Jeremy Vasquez and the way in which I actually provide kind of an example about how, I think within the paper, I provide an example about reforms that try to liberalize indigenous groups that actually ended up hurting them because they ended up being actually not connected to the European market. I use the example of cochinilla dyes in Mexico, about the reforms liberating them, basically giving them more technical power, actually disconnected them with the other roots of the empire. So this is a minor thing, but that's the only way in which I use indigenous groups in my paper. But I agree, I'm missing that.
Okay, so we went a couple minutes over, but that's okay because I built in 15 minutes to kind of have us have a little buffer between the panels. So we'll reconvene in 12 minutes at 10:30 for panel 2. Thanks to everyone for what was a great first panel.